Hey guys, welcome back to another Toker Talk. Today we're going to be discussing how we punish children for bad behavior. It's 4 o'clock here at the Kobra High home, so let's just jump right into it. Ineffective punishment. It's actually rather comical when people say the spanking debate, because the debate implies opposing arguments. And when it comes to spanking your children, there is no argument to be made in its favor from an objective point of view. Physical discipline is a popular form of punishment for children because it will usually make the child stop doing the behavior the parent wishes to correct, while also establishing the parent's authority over the child. Many fans of this parenting style will defend its use by insisting that coupled with proper communication, it'll help your child better remember the lesson. On the surface, this can seem reasonable, but it doesn't take much examining for this idea to start crumbling. First off, when you hit someone for doing something you find problematic, it's easy to look at the surface effects of that action and conclude its effectiveness. You hurt them, and now they've stopped doing what you considered to be a problem, but you haven't taught them why you think it's a problem or even why they shouldn't do it. What you have taught them is that if they do something you don't like, you're willing to hit them. Imagine applying that standard to any other person that you love in your life. Imagine if you thought it was acceptable to spank your grandmother because she said something you thought was rude, or to use a wooden spoon on your spouse when they do something you think is inconsiderate. Do you think it'd be reasonable for you to tell that loved one that it's alright that you physically abused them because it was for their own good? Of course not. So why would you want your child to ever think it's acceptable for people they love to physically harm them over disagreements? This is usually where you'll hear people saying it's needed to establish respect for authority. Without fear of harm, oppositional children will become unruly and undisciplined. Not only is this actually false, but in fact, every study ever done on the subject clearly indicates that moderate to heavy spanking and other forms of physical discipline cause your child to be more aggressive, more antisocial, more academically dysfunctional, and prone to both mental and physical health problems. I'll link a recent Harvard article that references a study on the neurological aspects of spanking and how it negatively affects brain development down below. So rather than establishing a respect for authority or reason, what you've actually done is taught your child to respect force and violence. And finally, this is where you'll find most proponents of spanking break down and try to reason that their use of physical discipline isn't like all those other examples because they always made sure to communicate the lesson to their child before and or after the punishment. They and their children are in fact no worse off for having been spanked. But this reasoning presents two problems. The first being, if your child could understand the lesson without violence, then what makes the violence necessary? If they couldn't understand the lesson, then how does violence help make them understand that lesson? If you have an answer to this question, please leave it down below in the comments. The second problem it creates is a cognitive dissonance, where a person can't recognize what they'd otherwise immediately see as a form of abuse. Not only does this cause you to rationalize and normalize the trauma you went through, it makes you much more prone to repeat it, especially during times of prolonged stress. This will cause you to act out while holding on to toxic emotions rather than empathy or reason, not only increasing your chances of resorting to excessive punishment, but it'll also set an example for your child to act out when they're holding on to toxic emotions instead of appealing to their empathy or reason. So if you want to effectively discipline your children, you'll need to start by effectively disciplining yourself. Effective consequences. There's an old proverb that you've almost certainly heard at least once in your lifetime. Do as I say, not as I do. This old piece of wisdom, cited for the very first time in the Table Talk of John Selden all the way back in 1818, means that any speaker isn't perfect, and you should focus on their instructions rather than their actions. That's a wonderful idea for those that understand the abstract, but for young children who are limited to a very concrete version of the world, such advice falls on deaf ears. Not only do young children have insufficient experience and knowledge to make sense of that idea, imitation is one of the main tools in their learning kit, meaning if there's a behavior you want your child to display, the best way to see that happen is by displaying that behavior yourself on a regular basis and reinforcing that behavior with positivity and praise. Inevitably, however, there will be times when your child's behavior crosses a line or gets beyond what is acceptable even of a child. Before punishing your child, you should consider 3 things to ensure the problem doesn't go beyond simple behavioral issues. The first thing to consider is impairment, which is to say how much of a problem the behavior is in an otherwise functional situation, like when your child is rude or unattentive to their surroundings. The second is how unmanageable the behavior itself is. If a child draws on your walls, you can solve that by taking away their drawing utensils. But if they headbutt a hole through your wall, that action would be much harder to maintain control of. And finally, you should ask yourself how dangerous the behavior is to your child and those around them. The reason I'd advise you to do this before deciding on your child's punishment is because your child might be subject to a mental or developmental disorder or disability, and you should always make sure such children are given the proper resources to thrive and be successful before before jumping the gun. Now, once you've determined that, Dr. Alan Cosden, PhD and professor of psychology and child psychiatry at Yale University, recommends using brief timeouts and brief suspensions of privileges for younger children. Like with all punishment, it needs to be measured and reasonable. The biggest factor to remember here is that to get the effect you want, a little goes a long way, because when it comes to punishment, less is more. 1 to 5 minute timeouts will set proper expectations for demonstrating to your child who's in charge of the situation, while also letting them know they won't be allowed to do as they please without consequence. The best way to administer this kind of punishment is by removing your child from the situation causing the problem, and not allowing them any reinforcers until the duration of their punishment is up. Where most parents struggle here is that their own perspective on the situation leaves them wanting to engage, either due to emotion or because they think it's necessary for guidance. But the reality is that if you want your child to understand boundaries, you need to be willing to enforce them. For example, if you tell your child to face the wall or sit on the couch for 5 minutes when they defy you for attention, by giving them that attention, you've now turned what was meant to be a punishment into a game, where the child's goal is to get your attention by acting against your wishes. But if you isolate that child in a safe environment, such as in their bedroom, you're enforcing that you have boundaries on behavior, and the child will have to reflect on those boundaries or face the consequences of their action again. Likewise, when taking away privileges, 24 hours is usually enough to drive home the point. You should take careful consideration as to what it is you're actually taking away from your child, of course, as there are some privileges that help encourage adaptive behavior, such as going to social events, being with friends, and skill workshops. A good rule of thumb is to consider how depraving your child of that privilege affects them, and is the punishment logical to the crime. For example, if your child throws their food on the floor in a tantrum, it might be reasonable to take away a treat for the day, but it wouldn't be reasonable to make them go without food for the rest of the day. Likewise, if your child is being disrespectful or explosive, might take away their phone or social media privileges for the day, but you wouldn't keep them from using the computer if they needed it for school. These standards ensure that your child has a sense of stability in their life, while still understanding their bad behavior will have consequences. When it comes to teenagers, I'll borrow Dr. Cosden's own words. For teenagers, it all begins with negotiating. Whenever you can, you want to sit down and chat with the teenager. Why? Because when you give choice, when you give discretion, when you give an opportunity, it's more likely that you'll come up with something that the child will actually do and cooperate with. Of course, without open communication and a clear example of proper behavior, any form of punishment won't be effective. So the most effective strategy for a parent is to have meaningful conversations with your children about their actions regularly, and to always be a model for the behavior that you wish to see in your own child. Alright guys, that'll do it for today's discussion. If you enjoyed, like, share, comment, subscribe, and remember to follow the high.